Before we jump into making web pages, it can be really helpful to look at the code for some existing web pages. First, let's review a tiny bit about navigating the web in general. When you want to visit a website, you use a browser to ask for it. This is called a request. When you make the request, you might be clicking on a link containing a URL, or typing that URL manually directly into the browser's URL bar. The browser then uses that URL to send the request out into the cloud. We're going to skip over exactly how that request is routed to the appropriate server, but when it gets there, the server examines the request to determine what it should send back, and then sends the appropriate file back to the browser that requested it. This is called the response. There are lots of ways that the server can construct the file, but when we think about web pages, we usually receive HTML code as the main part of the response. Your browser then uses the HTML code and supporting files to construct the page you see. But we can also see this code. Here I've requested a website that I use a lot when teaching and learning web development, the W3 Schools homepage. I typed in w3schools.com into the browser's URL bar, and that sent off the request, and the W3 Schools website sent me back the files to construct this web page. So let's take a look at what it exactly sent us. By right-clicking somewhere on this page, I can choose View Page Source. And this shows me in a new tab exactly the HTML code that the server sent as the response to my request. It looks like a lot, but don't be alarmed. It's totally okay to not understand all this code at first glance. This can be really useful though when you want to see all the code that your browser received from the server. You might recognize some of these angle brackets as HTML code. Usually when I'm looking at the full source delivered to my browser, I'm looking for a reference to another file that the page is using, like a CSS file. I can find those quickly with the Find feature. I'm going to use Command F here on my Mac. It would be Control F on a Windows box or a Linux box. But when I press Command F, it brings up this Find bar, and there I can type in something like .css to try to find the .css file references. Here, the second one out of 12 references on this page is right here, and it's this link to a CSS file from a library somewhere in the W3 Schools source code, and it's applying those styles to the web page. I can even click this link and see that code in another new tab. Again, don't worry too much about what this code is exactly at this point. The point is that we can see all the code the browser received. Now back to the HTML. This source code includes a bunch of JavaScript in these script tags. We don't need that yet either. We want to start with HTML and CSS, so all of this JavaScript is just getting in my way. In a lot of cases, it might be better to use a different tool for viewing source code. So let's close this tab and try something else. Now I'm right-clicking again to get this context menu. And here we have an option to inspect. So let's try that. Now in the same browser tab, this opened a panel called the Developer Tools. And there are lots of different tools here, but it opened the HTML inspector on the left and the CSS inspector on the right. Mine is already zoomed in a little bit with Control plus or Command plus, but if you need to zoom out or zoom in, hold Control or on your Mac Command, and use the plus or minus keys to zoom in and out. Also, sometimes it's really useful to dock to a different part of your screen. So I'm going to expand this. Here in the three-dot menu, there are options to where you want to dock these tools. By default, they're docked to the bottom, but I often prefer to dock them on the right-hand side. That way I get a little more vertical space, and I get the option to resize the panel by clicking and dragging the divider bar, and that also gives me a little bit of a preview of what the website looks like on mobile as it resizes the width. So now I have the developer tools exactly how I like them, zoomed in a little bit and docked to the right-hand side. Let's actually see what these tools are doing. The HTML inspector is this panel up here with all the HTML code. And it has already attempted to find the element that I right-clicked on, and it's this div. We can also pop these open and closed to see what elements are nested inside of each other. And as I am scrolling and hovering, it's highlighting which element it is on the page. This can be super useful when you're trying to find the correct element, but you're not sure which tag created the element. The CSS inspector, below the HTML inspector, it automatically changes to show you the CSS applied to the element that is currently selected in the HTML inspector. So right now, I've clicked on this div in the HTML inspector, and the CSS for that div is what's showing in the CSS pane below. If I click on a different one, like this H1, that CSS pane switches and shows me the code that is being applied to that element. So, the CSS inspector is really useful for debugging your CSS code. It can help you find out what other websites are doing to create cool effects. And you can try out some different values for the CSS properties on the elements. For example, on this div, there are a couple of color codes here. And they have these little swatches. So you can click on the color swatch and get a color picker. You can work with the hex code, or you can change it to RGBA format. That's in decimals, so these values are just 0 to 255. And then the alpha channel is 0 to 1 in decimal form. That gives you some opacity. So maybe I want to remove all the red value from this color. This is really cool that I just edited that color and I could see exactly how it affected the page. I can perhaps remove all the blue now, and it's significantly more green because the only part of this color code is the green value. There's also an eyedropper tool here that allows you to pick exactly one of the pixels from the page to become your currently selected color. The changes you make in the CSS panel are not permanent, and I'm the only one who can see the ones I've made. When I refresh this page, it's going to make the request again and get back to the code that was delivered to reconstruct the page. This tool is so powerful, you might wonder, why would you ever choose View Page Source when you can just inspect? That's a really good question, and for the most part, you probably will use the inspector more than the View Page Source. But it's important to understand that the inspector shows what is called the rendered code. If there are any errors in the original source, or if there was a change made to the code with JavaScript after it was delivered to the browser, then the inspector will have new, adjusted, updated, rendered code. If you are trying to debug a problem, you might really need to view page source to see what the original code was before the browser made corrections or adjustments. We'll see that in another video about debugging. For now, you're ready to try out these two tools for viewing HTML and CSS code in the browser. Try it on your favorite websites and see how they created the elements you use most. Try adjusting some of the values to really see what they can do and have some fun.